Wherever you are on your leadership voyage, it starts here.
Hey everyone, welcome to Leadership Voyage, the podcast dedicated to your pursuit of becoming a great leader. My name is Jason Wick, and I'm happy to have you here for Season 2, Episode 10, which is a great conversation with Michael D. Watkins, the author of the iconic book, The First 90 Days. Before we get to that conversation, the show's website is leadership.voyage. The email address at which you can reach me, Jason Wick, is startyourvoyage@gmail.com. If you're a frequent listener, please subscribe and review the podcast. That helps others find out about Leadership Voyage. If you're new, have a listen. Let me know what you think, and subscribe if you are interested in what we're talking about here. Before I outline my conversation with Michael Watkins, let's not forget about Instacart. You can get free grocery delivery on your first order of $35 or more. Deliveries can come in as fast as 1 hour. Click the link in the show's notes to go to Instacart, sign up, and try it out for yourself. I myself am a customer. So as I said, I had the opportunity to speak with Michael Watkins of Genesis Advisors, professor, and he is the author of The First 90 Days. The First 90 Days is a book about transitions. It has sold over 1.5 million copies since it was written in 2003, updated in 2013, and currently Michael's working on the third edition. What do I talk about with Michael in this conversation? Well, we talk a little bit about decision-making first and foremost, and then we dive into transitions, which are very important for leaders as you're changing contexts in an organization or joining a new organization. We talk about how people can make a successful, clean break in their transition, moving from an old role to a new role, which is very challenging. We talk about culture and why it's important to understand culture. We get into learning and what are some of the things that people can do to learn effectively and accelerate their learning. We also talk about a process of understanding the context for the new team that you're leading and how to go about assessing the team. I know you're going to get a lot of value out of this conversation with Michael Watkins. I sure did. So please enjoy it here on the latest episode of Leadership Voyage. Okay, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Leadership Voyage. I am fortunate enough to be here with Michael Watkins. Michael, it is really nice to meet you this morning for me, this afternoon for you.
Delighted to be able to be with you.
Great, thank you so much. I just found out you're in, you said near Zurich, right?
I am. I've lived in Zurich for, over 10 years now, just outside of Zurich, a place called Silicon. I teach at a business school in Switzerland in Lausanne called IMB.
Beautiful. That's so cool. Yeah, I didn't realize. I was just complaining about how early it was for me, but this is a wonderful compromise. So thank you again for taking some time today. For those who are or aren't familiar with your work, you've been a leadership consultant for over 20 years right now. Genesis Advisors is the group. And you wrote the book, The First 90 Days, which has maybe a life of its own after 20 years or however long it's been out. It's sold over 1.5 million copies. I was thinking about it this morning. I was like, what's that equivalent to in, the fiction world? Like maybe a John Grisham novel or something. I don't know. It's really cool to see. And you're on the Thinkers 50 list, which for those who are unaware is a list that comes out every 2 years now and has the 50 most influential thinkers in the world of business and management. And I'm wondering, hearing all those bullet points, how does it feel knowing that you've had such a significant impact on the leadership and management communities around the world?
Yeah. So I have two reactions, right? One is, you say 20 years, and I think, yeah, I was in my late teens, Jason, when I started down the road of, doing
You're off to a great
leadership
start.
work. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's the first chapter, right? I guess the other reaction I have, is kind of, I think of myself as the accidental guru, right? Because I was never out to become a management thinker per se, right? I was very interested in the subject. I was at the Harvard Business School at the time. I was actually teaching negotiation. My PhD was in game theory and decision theory. And I just got interested in this subject of leadership transitions. And I got interested in it in part because I was teaching in a program with experienced leaders about org change, which I thought I knew a fair amount about. And one of them put up their hand and said, "Excuse me, Professor Watkins, you seem to be assuming that I know the organization, I know the people, I know where the bodies are buried, and I understand the culture, and armed with all that knowledge, I can change the world, right?" And he says, "But what if I'm new in the job and I don't know any of those things, right?" I'm like, the split screen kind of happens. One side is saying, "Wow, really interesting question." The other side is, "I have no idea how to answer this question," right? so that was the impetus for this voyage, right? This journey, and it's been awesome, right? Even after 20 years, I remain fascinated by leadership transitions. I work extensively with senior leaders taking new roles. I'm learning things all the time. I'm writing things all the time. So it's been wonderful.
Thanks for sharing all that. And I appreciate the anecdote of the student saying you're assuming all these things, and that's great. I think understanding our context is everything. And so thanks for sharing all of that. The book itself, which I think is going to be the kind of the foundation for most of our discussion, is indeed about transitions and all that goes along with that. But before we kind of dive into a variety of topics around it, you mentioned you had PhD in game theory and decision theory, I think you just said. If you could just share one important piece of advice with us about decision making, or something that you want us all to know about decision making, what would it be?
So it actually connects fairly deeply to making successful transitions, right? Because as you're taking a new role, you're going to feel internal pressure to start to make decisions and take action. I call it the action imperative, right? That internal pressure. Jason says to himself, "I need to prove myself. I need to show whoever they are that they made the right choice in putting me in this role." And that can lead you to make decisions perhaps before you're as informed as you need to be. And so I always say, basically, look, think about balancing, almost like a triangle, right? Of learning and connecting on one side, deciding and acting on the other, and reflecting and planning on the bottom, right? And sort of you're moving around that cycle. And don't get driven to making consequential decisions too early, right? Now, sometimes you have to, right? I worked with a leader a while back who took a role, and she had to deliver a strategic plan for her new organization in 2 weeks, no negotiation, right? So, okay, like things like that happen, right?
Yep.
But far more often in my experience, Jason, it's the internal pressure to act and decide that can get people into fairly deep trouble, right? And so just make sure you're balancing the learning and connecting piece with the deciding and acting piece. If you're going to make early decisions, try to make ones that aren't kind of totally irreversible or really big. Years ago, I talked to the then CEO of CBS, and he said something I always remembered about this. He said, "I want people to think early on that I'm decisive, but I've decided not to decide yet on some key issues."
Could you say that one more time?
He wants people to think he's decisive, but has decided not to decide yet.
Okay.
On some key issues, right? And so he'd make some early, very low, kind of risk decisions, and people go, "Oh, wow, he's, Jason, wow, he's in there, he's making decisions," right? And that sort of bought him, the time to embed himself more deeply in the deeper issues that he was facing and make good decisions about them.
What a cool framing. It's like I want to have the identity, or I want others to perceive me as a decisive person. And therefore, that I could decide. I could decide at any time, but I've decided not to. That's a cool compromise, like with ourselves. I love that. That's brilliant. Well, thanks for sharing that wisdom and balancing the learning and connecting with the acting and deciding. Thank you for sharing that, Michael. So the first 90 days, updated and expanded, proven strategies for getting up to speed faster and smarter, is all about transitions. It is like an encyclopedia. I was telling my wife, boy, I feel like every page is just filled with wisdom. So thank you for that, first of all. Why do you think the topic of transitions is so important?
So it's funny, I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, Jason, and when I look at people's LinkedIn profiles, I count the number of jobs they've had,
Okay.
right? Because that's equivalent in some sense, kind of, to the number of transitions you've gone through. And I count 10, right, in your profile.
Okay.
And I think that's one of the key messages I say, which is, look, you're going to go through lots of transitions into new roles in your career, right? Your midpoint, maybe not quite in your career, so you maybe got another 10 ahead of you, right? And so the sooner you learn to be good at making transitions, the better. And transitions are times when there's typically a lot at stake, right? You're excited, but you're also concerned. You're relatively vulnerable at moments like that. You've got to find ways to create momentum. And so being thoughtful and systematic about it is really, really important. And then if you look at it from the point of view of organizations, you've got hundreds, thousands of people going into new roles, every month, year, whatever the numbers are, right? And there's huge stakes for the organization in getting people up to speed faster, right? So there's both a personal piece to it and an organizational piece to it. One question I always ask folks too, sorry, I know this is a reverse interview and
Oh, no, it's okay. I'm good.
Forgive me for that. The toughest job transition you personally went through, what was it?
The toughest transition I ever went through was, it was about 6 years ago. And I was asked to start leading a team that was really struggling and going through a lot of adversity. And at the same time, that there was a business need to have someone try to lead this group through turnaround or realignment. I'm not sure which one it is, actually, thinking right on the spot. I also was taking on a new scope of managing folks in which they were much more technical than I was accustomed to.
So it's a great example, right? And it's a great example for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, I love talking to people about the toughest transitions they've experienced, because it's often, it's also often a learning crucible for people. And so there's several dimensions, and most people taking new roles are going through multiple transitions in parallel, right? And you described a couple, right? One is the turnaround scenario that you're put into with the new team. And the other is leading a different kind of person, right? Deeply expert technically. Congratulations, you aren't. How do you build credibility in a situation like that? How do you create value in a situation like that, right? So it's a great example of some key things that you can face. And there is often this overlay of different transitions going on. And taking the time to kind of pull that apart and say, well, okay, I'm doing this, I'm transitioning that way. Which of these is hard? What's making this hard overall? Those are, I think, very useful questions to be asking yourself.
When we talk about going through a transition, either a new role internally for us in the same organization or coming from the outside, it presents some similar challenges and some distinct challenges, at least in my read and my interpretation. We've got so many things we can dive into here that I've just kind of picked a handful we can get into and see where we end up. Folks who get promoted internally. So they're going, I guess in my example here, I don't even remember if it was promotion, but it was a transition for sure. You talk about the importance of a clean break. And this stood out to me as something that I think, at least in my experience, is something that's difficult, because keep doing that old thing or whatever it might be, while you're doing your new thing. And what does success look like with a clean break in your eyes?
Well, I guess, first of all, those two examples you gave, Jason, of promotion and onboarding, they're two examples I use a lot to talk about differences in types of transitions. So maybe let's get into that after I answer the immediate question. Look, it's all too common that people are asked to play two roles in parallel. And that is terrible. on multiple levels, right? Because the whole point of having a transition is to be able to focus on the new role and get up to speed. And if you're consuming 80% of your effort trying to close off what you're doing before, and usually that's because there wasn't good planning, in putting in place a replacement for you, there was no logical successor, whatever the reasons are, you're kind of entangled in that. It's negative for you. And again, it's negative for the organization, right? And so doing the best you can to wrap things up as quickly as you can. Some colleagues and I actually late last year wrote an article, early this year, one or the other, about how to quit well. Like not quit as in quit the company, but how to leave a team well, right? That leaving process, right? And it's kind of related because it's really about how do you negotiate expectations about what you're going to do to exit. At the same time, how do you kind of deal with the emotional dynamics of leaving the team that you've been with, right? So yeah, it's unfortunately all too much the case that you're asked to play these two roles. And then the best you can do is figure out how to wrap things up as quickly as possible and put the energy where it really should be, which is on getting up to speed in new roles. And then on the issue of promotions versus onboarding, if it's okay to go there, you're promoted, and let's assume you're promoted in the same organization, right? Because if you're moving to another organization, that's some combination of promotion and onboarding going on. But let's assume you're promoted in the same organization, right? The sorts of questions that you need to be asking yourself and the sorts of changes you go through are around things like, how do I delegate effectively in the new role, right? Because what may have been effective delegation at the level below looks like micromanagement at the new level. And so rethinking delegation. How do I communicate when I'm at a greater distance from the front line? How does that change? Is there a substantial change in the political dynamics at the new level that I'm at? Do I need to show up differently in some way? Does my presence have to be different than it was? That's common to any promotion. And then promotions in place, it can be, leading former peers, which is really hard in its own right? Because you may have people who think they should have got the job, or you may have people, who are not sure, they want to be led by you necessarily, right? And how do you strike the right balance, in both continuing to, motivate the team, but also exert your authority without becoming, Napoleon. Those are some classic challenges you face when you're promoted. When you look at onboarding into new companies, it's very often lateral move, right? You were a director at your own company. Now you're maybe a director, senior director at the new one. Yeah. Sometimes it's promotion, right? Sometimes, but very often it's not. You're brought in sort of laterally with the expectation that you'll go up. So, let's say you're a VP coming in from the outside. You don't necessarily need to learn to be a VP, right? What you need to learn about more is the culture and politics of the new organization that you're starting in. And what the research shows, Egon Zehnder did some research on this, that the biggest reasons why people onboarding fail have nothing to do typically with their competence or their decision-making ability. And it's everything to do with them running afoul of the culture or not building the right political connections, right? Not working effectively with peers. And so it's just a really different dynamic. And then of course, sometimes you've got the both, right? And that makes it really challenging. But the key point here is, focus on the right things. If you're onboarding, you want to be putting a fair amount of focus on how do I learn about the culture? How do I, avoid becoming, the virus that gets attacked by the immune system, sort of metaphorically, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in promotion, it's really how do I want to show up in the context of that new role.
And I'm seeing a connection, if you think where the decision-making question kind of relates to onboarding here. You don't want to jump in and disrupt. I mean, eventually you will, of course, but take that time, right? And really try to understand what's going on and listen and watch and all that kind of stuff.
So yes, but and okay. I think you hit it earlier when you were talking about, am I in a turnaround or a realignment? One of the frameworks in the book that I think people have found really helpful is the one you were sort of alluding to, which is the STARS framework, right? Startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, sustaining success. The relative balance of learning versus doing really varies dramatically among those, right? You're in a turnaround and the alarm bells are going off and the lights are flashing, and it's completely acceptable that you'll come in and you'll start to do things pretty quickly, right? And maybe some really hard things have to happen pretty quickly. And it's not typically dangerous to do that because you've got, the case for change has been made for you, right?
Right.
But the metaphorical, burning platform is present. Realignment or sustaining success, typically you're going to spend a lot longer on the learning curve to make sure you really understand things before you start making choices. So it's not necessarily always the case, I guess is my point, that onboarding means go slow. Onboarding means be really thoughtful about the right pacing, given the situation that you're in, right? For you coming into that turnaround as an example.
No, thank you. And yeah, for those listening who are going to be checking out the book, this STARS model that Michael, that you just referred to, you said in a realignment or a sustaining success, maybe you're taking more time. Again, it's context driven, which of course makes sense. Going back to your example of someone out there went through a lateral move to a different organization, and let's just say they are sustaining success or something like that in this context. They're going to try to understand and take the time to really digest what the culture is that they are onboarding into. And I love to ask people this question, in your words, what is culture? And why is it important to understand the culture you're in?
So what is culture, right? So I use an old model of culture that really came out from a guy named Edgar Schein at MIT that looks at culture as kind of a set of layers of important things to focus on, right? And the top layer is the shared language of the organization, right? So, you think about the organization you work for, make music, right? There's going to be a language of that organization, right? That you need to speak, acronyms that people use, references they make, that if you don't understand that language, you have a tough time figuring out what's going on, and you sound like an outsider, right? And so the linguistic dimension of culture is an important one. At the very base level is things like values, core beliefs, what people believe to be true, what they believe to be important. And organizations do have values. It's not typically the values that are up on the little value chart on the wall. I mean, sometimes those match, but often they do not, right? It's the real value set of the organization. And it typically takes you longer to get into understanding those things. And then there's the really critical middle level, which is behavioral norms. It's how we do things here. It's what's acceptable behaviors and unacceptable behaviors. What are the behavioral patterns that we see operating? And I pay a lot of attention with the folks I coach to look at that level and make sure you're really tuning into how do things get done here. Even if you're there to change it, it's important to tune in and understand it. Yeah. And I sort of alluded to the, immunological metaphor of organizational culture, right? I sometimes say, look, culture is like the organization's immune system. It's there to prevent bad things and bad people from surviving inside the body of the organization. And, you do the wrong things, you're a virus, you're a bacteria, antibodies are secreted, killer T cells clump around you. And ultimately, you're either digested or expelled from the organism. Yeah, so it's a very biological process in a sense. And to continue that metaphor, your job in part is, especially if you're there to change the culture, is to kind of fool the immune system into accepting you, right? So that you can begin to, I'll keep pushing this metaphor, I'll stop in a minute, inject new DNA into the organism, right? So that's sort of the way I kind of think about it. By the way, that conceptualization of culture is also very helpful for driving transformation in organizations, because it says, look, one way to do it is to introduce new language and new concepts into the organization. That's that linguistic layer. Another really powerful thing is, use the incentive system and other tools to reshape people's behavior. Because we know if you change people's behavior over time, it'll shift their attitudes, right? So a model of culture is helpful not just for onboarding, it's also helpful when you start thinking about driving transformation in organizations.
And in that last bit, you're referring to rewarding people for the behaviors that we want to see.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Right. So you come into an organization and people are, behaving in too much a siloed way, hypothetically, right? And you're leading a team of these people, and to your shock and surprise, you find they're being incentivized to operate basically independently. Wow. So maybe you think about, okay, how do I reshape the incentive system to emphasize more of the group behavior, right? The group accomplishment, right? A very simple example. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. No, I'm digging the immune system metaphor, so thanks for going with that. And also, I really do appreciate the description you're providing of culture, whether it's your own or you've taken it from another or you've refined it, where we have these layers with values, behaviors, and language. And so thanks for that. I think that'll resonate with people to think through the different layers rather than one sentence that captures culture maybe a little too simply in some cases.
I think it is too simple, Jason.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael. Wonderful. As I said, tons of different topics we can jump into about transitions. I'm just going to hop into a couple more here while we have our time together. Okay, what strikes me that effectively transitioning is predicated on effectively learning. So whether we're talking about transitions or just the process of learning anywhere, however you choose to interpret the question, what are some of the things that you think we should be dialed into in order to be learning effectively?
Yeah, I'm going to preface it by saying that it's changed over time in interesting ways, right? So the original version of the first 90 days was written in 2003. The second edition came out in 2013. And I'm in the process of finishing up the third edition right now. And so much has changed in that time, right? For example, hybrid work, right? Or remote work. And so how you need to learn about an organization when you take a new role it's different than it was in 2003. And it was different than it was in 2013. And it's things like that mean I have to, periodically produce these new editions because important things change, right? So I just want to stipulate that up front. So look, I see two foundations to making successful transitions, right? It's learning and it's connecting. And if you don't do enough of either or both of those, you're kind of setting yourself up for difficulty. With the learning piece, the name of the game is really how do you gain as much actionable insight early as possible to begin to make the right choices, focus on the right things, figure out how you're going to create value in the new role, build the alliances with the right stakeholders and so on, right? So learning is absolutely a foundation. And the faster and more effectively you can learn, the quicker you're able to do those critical things, right? So that's kind of the logic, if you will, for why learning is so important in transitions. Kind of obvious, but there it is. And then there's the, okay, great. How do I speed up that process, right? And that's where I think the action really happens. The way I frame it is, how do I, garner as much actionable insight as early as possible? That's the way I kind of frame the problem, right? And then I think there's a few things that flow from that, right? First of all, being clear about what you need to learn, right? So, and I have this little framework that relates to the conversation we just had about technical, cultural, and political learning. Technical is products, markets, technologies, competitors, systems, processes, right? Culture, what we just talked about, political, power, influence, networks, and organizations, yeah? And thinking about, okay, well, what's the relative balance of those things that I need to focus on, right? And it will be different depending on the kind of transition you're going through. But just getting clear on what are the most important things I need to learn about this organization, right? And fixing yourself on that, knowing that that's going to change, right? That's that's a living agenda, right?
Yeah,
It's not a once and for all, right? It's going to need to be updated on a regular basis, but it's good to have a learning agenda as a starting point, right? So that's part A. Part B is, what are the best sources of actionable insight? Where do I go to learn what I need to learn, right? Is it this report? Is it that person? Is it the longstanding, employee who's the natural historian of the organization? Is it my HR person who can give me insight into the culture of the place? Right. It's thinking about the sources of insight and where to go to learn. And then so that's part B. Part A, the agenda. Part B, sources of actionable insight. Part C, are there things I can do to be a little more systematic in how I go about learning that will speed the process up? Yeah. And in the book, I give some ideas about that, but one simple one that I use sometimes as an example is, I inherit a new team, right? Because typically, in most cases, leaders don't get to build their teams. Yeah. They get to inherit a team, and they need to assess and evolve it into their team, right? And that's a really interesting process. It's something I work with a lot with my clients about, literally putting in place a team evolution plan, as it were, right? For thinking about how to do that. Now, applying learning to the team, you want to be assessing that team early. You want to get some insight into the team, its dynamics, the relative strengths of people on the team. You can be systematic in doing that, right? I always recommend that folks, identify 4 or 5 key questions and ask everyone the same set of questions, right? How do you see our strengths? Where do you see our vulnerabilities? What's the biggest opportunities? You can use SWOT or something as a framework if you want. If you were me, what would you be focusing on? And just the simple act of being systematic and asking everyone the same questions generates insight. And it generates insight where people agree. It generates insight where people disagree. It generates insight into the people. You can feed back what you've learned, and people go, wow, Jason's picked up a lot in a short time. But you also learn something from the reactions of the team as you feed back what you've learned. And so it's a very simple example of how just being a little bit systematic in the learning process can really accelerate it. Does that make sense, Jason?
It does. If I'm hearing you correctly, have a living learning agenda about what you intend to glean in all stages, because as we said, living. Second, try to identify the sources of actionable insight. And when speaking with these folks, be systematic in your approach to, I guess, interviewing them.
Exactly. That's exactly right. By the way, that last piece you just mentioned is not a small piece, right? Being good at active listening turns out to be like a profoundly important skill for making successful transitions.
Yeah, and boy, it's a tiring thing to continually do. Yeah, but worth it. No, that's great. I can't resist jumping on one, not negatively, jumping onto something that you said about SWOT, which is SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. In the second edition of the book, which is the one that I just read from 2013, it suggests TOES, threats, opportunities, weaknesses, and strengths. And it talks about doing that order because we're talking about certain elements of that framework where we're evaluating outside of our company and certain elements we're evaluating inside of our company. This is perhaps tangential to a lot of what we're talking about, but I kind of can't resist, since you said it, if you wouldn't mind going in a little more deeply into folks who are doing SWOT analyses and why you suggest a TOES analysis.
Sure. So these are examples of little things where I kind of like to dig in and figure out where something came from and maybe offer a little bit of a contrarian point of view, right? That's probably a personality flaw, but there it is, right, Jason? But no, so here's the thing, right? I was doing lots of SWOT with teams, I still do some, but I do it with TOES, and I'll talk about why. And what I was finding was, I'm sitting down with you and the rest of the team, and I'm saying, okay, what's our strengths? Yeah, I guess I'm a pretty good badminton player. I don't know, right? what are my weaknesses? Well, I never want to talk about my weaknesses. I don't have any, or I'll pick some tiny little thing. I mean, I'm joking, right? But
Yes.
but what I found was asking people about an organization's strengths and weaknesses tended to become a very abstract, not terribly useful conversation. Whereas if we started off saying, what are the threats we face? Okay. Yeah, we can talk about that. We've got this competitor doing this. We've got this, government agency doing that, right? We can pretty quickly identify those things. What are some of our biggest opportunities? Well, we could launch a new product in that space, right? We could participate in this forum. You can have a very concrete discussion, typically, right, with teams about threats and opportunities. And then you say, okay, given the threats, are we vulnerable? And if so, what are the weaknesses we have that make us vulnerable? And you can say, okay, we got these opportunities. Are our strengths helpful in realizing those opportunities?
Yeah.
And now we're really talking about weaknesses and strengths in a useful way, right? And so that's why I do it the way I do it. And actually, I actually just finished writing the chapter for the new edition, and I've kept that. And I've actually given more instructions on how to do that with your team, right? Because I do think it's really valuable to do that. One of the most important things I think you do as a leader is make sure that your team has a shared view of reality, right? If you don't have a shared view of reality as a team, you have a very large problem for a variety of reasons, right? And so tools like SWOT, tools like STARS are actually quite useful ways of making sure you're on the same page, right? Because in the act of doing that, you're kind of helping the team create a shared understanding of these are our threats and these are our opportunities and these are our strengths and these are our weaknesses, right? And so and likewise, I do something similar with teams around STARS, right? I did it with a team at a big vision care company 2 weeks ago, right? We've got different business units within the larger structure. Are we all agreed that that's in turnaround? That's in realignment.
Sure.
That's sustaining success. And they weren't.
Yeah.
So we had a great conversation about it, right? And again, but the point is getting that team anchored in a shared view of reality, which is then a foundation for figuring out what you're going to do.
Thank you for adding that. Something that struck me as you said that was in Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. There's the section, face the brutal facts and never lose faith, or something like that, right? Those two just connected for me. I love that. We all need to see the same reality of what we're facing, and in this case, the threats and opportunities and our own strengths and weaknesses, and how are we going to move forward together around it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, what I add to that too is how do we make sure we stay anchored in reality? Right? How do we have the right systems and processes to sense and respond to what's going on in the environment? Right? Because if you don't, again, the whole team may diverge from reality.
Yeah.
Which is also not a good thing.
Speaking of teams diverging from reality, one of the last questions I wanted to ask is when someone's taking over a new team, and you said earlier, oftentimes we are not starting our own team or building our own team. We are inheriting a team or something like that. It's not necessarily the most fun thing to think about, but as a new leader with a new team, we are assessing our team, and perhaps it's related to TOES. What are our strengths and weaknesses too? So what advice do you have for us on a good way to go about assessing a new team that we're taking on?
For most leaders, the team is the largest source of leverage they have, right? You're just one person alone, you can't do much. So a question I always push people on in coaching on transitions is, how will you gain leverage? How will you amplify yourself is another way to think about it, right? And that could be building the right relationships and alliances. It could be leveraging that new technology, to make work more efficient. But usually the team is the number one source of leverage or amplification, right? So it's really important that you get the team in place. Point one. Point two, when you arrive, it's typically not the team you need, It's certainly not your team. It may become your team, but typically there's also work you need to do to evolve that membership of that team, the focus of that team, the way that team collaborates to really do what you need it to do. And that's the work, right? I'm going to tease you, right? You said it can sound a little dull or boring. It's actually anything but that, right?
Okay.
To me, it's endlessly fascinating to do this work, right? Because most leaders I work with, they know this, right? They know how important getting the right team is in place. So even though it can be a bit of a grind to go through it, the fact of the impact and the implications really drives the interest typically of leaders. Yeah. And then as is often the case, I also look at this through like the lens of an intellectual interest of a forum, right? There wasn't much out there when I started about how to inherit and assess teams. Surprising, right? There's lots about building teams, but they mostly assumed it was an intact team. And it was mostly about the dynamics as opposed to evolving the roles and structure of the team. So that was kind of work that I sort of pioneered, right? So I guess that's just a couple of prefaces, right, to think about it. And then we touched a little bit on how you assess the team, and I gave you the example of asking everyone the same questions. But even before you do that, there's some things you want to be thinking about. One of which we've already mentioned, right, which is what's the star situation we're in? Because I'm going to build a team differently if I'm in turnaround than I am if I'm in startup or in accelerated growth or realignment, right? So your team building approach is really shaped, not completely, but in a substantial measure by the nature of the situation you're in. You're in turnaround, you may be replacing a lot of people early, right? You're in sustaining success, you're probably going to, continue with virtually all the team as it is, at least initially, So that's point one. Point two is how much teamwork is really necessary. It's kind of almost like motherhood and apple pie that thou shalt build a team, right? But in some circumstances, it's not really what's required, right? You're leading people working fairly independently. You're better off managing them one-on-one, right? There may be some things you do collectively for the sake of morale, or there may be some tasks you want to take on. And other teams, they need to be deeply integrated to do it, right? And so don't kind of assume there's going to be one approach to building your team, or even one, kind of level at which teamwork needs to happen, because it doesn't, right? And then I guess, and then third, before you get into the assessment process, what are you looking for in people, right? And partially that can be things like, trust and reliability, which is a general thing. In part, it can be a specific set of expertise that you need. But I think the point is getting clarity in your own head about what you're looking for, right? So if you do those three things, right, you identify the scenario, your end stars model, you think about how much teamwork do I really need to drive here, and you're clear about what you're looking for, that's a hugely valuable foundation for then beginning to dive into that work of assessment.
That's great. Thank you for recapping all that and for all the great suggestions. And again, for all the listeners, just a few topics we've hit here, and I really do mean it, Michael. This book is just so packed with helpful information. And again, thank you for writing it. And it's obvious you've already impacted so many folks with it and will continue to impact more folks with it. So thank you. Fingers crossed. Yes. Last question is the same question I ask every single guest at the end. It can be related to your work or anything else. It doesn't matter to me. What is something that you have learned recently?
Prompt engineering on ChatGPT.
Okay.
Yeah, so I actually come out of a technology background. So I was an electrical engineer and a control systems designer early in my career. I did some work with early knowledge management systems, and I've stayed interested, right? I've also got an oldest son who's really into, AI. And so he, a week after ChatGPT came out, sent me a note and said, you got to see this, right? You got to look at this. And so I went on and got an account, and my mind was blown very quickly, right? Because I did things like, okay, tell me, do you know who Michael Watkins is? The the author of the first 90 days. Yes, I'm aware of Michael Watkins, right? So tell me about the writing style of Michael Watkins, right? 3 paragraphs on my writing style. Okay, write me 3 paragraphs on the following topic in the style of Michael Watkins. Boom, right? Mind blown. Yeah. And I've been working with it since. I use ChatGPT every single day today. I used it today to analyze some interview data from a large Korean company that I'm going to be doing some leadership development work with, and they sent me 75 pages of interview notes.
Oh, wow.
And I took that and chunk by chunk, I put it into ChatGPT and said, tell me what the themes are in this, right? And it gave me some really good answers, So that's something I've learned recently. I would say to everybody, I do say to everybody, this is the coming wave, and it's a very large wave. And you're either going to be on top of that wave or you're going to be underneath it, and you do not want to be underneath it. So in my own organization and IMD, I'm pushing folks very hard to, get out in front of the AI revolution.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. And as you said, when you're engineering the prompt for chat, I always have a hard time saying it, for Chat GPT, the type of question you are asking, it's everything. I think one thing I've been seeing on LinkedIn as a theme of these little helpful infographics is essentially, it's not Google search, right?
Right.
There's a lot more power there, and you've exhibited that with the kind of the line of questioning you went through progressively.
And there's an entirely new occupation called prompt engineer, to design the right prompts to ask the systems to get the right information, which is fascinating. Yeah.
There you have it. Wow. Michael Watkins of Genesis Advisors, author of The First 90 Days, professor, and just a nice guy to talk to as well. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. I really appreciate having the conversation with you today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Jason. Great to talk with you.
There you have it, everybody. My conversation with Michael Watkins, the author of The First 90 Days, a book that has persisted for 20 years, the 3rd edition coming out soon. And I think you can catch a glimpse just through some of these different topics in the discussion, how much information is in this book. If you haven't read it, check it out. Each chapter is a masterclass. I absolutely believe in that statement. So here's a summary, which I think is a microcosm of how much value you can get from this book, because it's a lot of information just in this summary. We started off, Michael saying he kind of became an accidental guru when he was teaching at Harvard, teaching about organizational change. A student kind of challenged this idea that all of what he was teaching was based had a lot of assumptions in it already, and a light bulb kind of went off for Michael that, wow, there are a lot of questions to be answered here around transition. When we talked about decision making, he said, oftentimes people in a new role, it presents them with this internal pressure to be impactful, which can lead them to making uninformed decisions. Find the balance between learning and connecting and deciding and acting. So make sure you're taking the time to learn and connect, and balance that with deciding and acting. Early decisions should be not too big. Maybe try to make them with not too much at stake as you get started. We talked about transitions and why they were important. Well, first of all, we go through many transitions. He even pointed out I have gone through 10 different jobs on my LinkedIn profile, which was kind of interesting to hear. Transitions are times when usually a lot is at stake, and that's also why they're important. And oftentimes there are multiple transitions that overlay on top of each other, which just compounds things. How to make a clean break So we're trying to go from one role to another. How can we do that? And Michael said, man, being asked to do two roles in parallel is very difficult, but it happens. And the whole point of the transition, we have to remember, the whole point is to go to this new role. Usually the result of doing two roles in parallel is from poor planning, but remember that, again, the point of the transition is to get to your new role and try to wrap things up as quickly as you can. Leaving your old team it's a challenging thing to do, but you can do it well. And negotiating the expectations around this clean break and starting the new role is very important. We talked about promotion versus onboarding. And when it came to promotion, there are new ways to delegate once you get promoted. You're communicating from a distance now. Things are different. What should your presence be like? And sometimes you're faced with the challenge of leading former peers. When you're onboarding in a new company, usually it's a lateral move. You're moving from a position kind of like what you had to something kind of like that in a new company. And culture and politics are usually the reason people are failing in these transitions of onboarding. It's not because of competence, usually. Michael talks in the book, and we talked in this discussion about the STARS model. STARS is an acronym for Startup, Turnaround, Accelerated Growth, Realignment, and Sustained Success. Knowing which context you are in is important. When we spoke about culture, he suggested that culture is layers. It's layers of values, behaviors, and we want to clearly know what it is we need to learn. Is it technical, cultural, political? In other words, we want to have a living learning agenda. We have to identify the sources of our actionable insight and then be systemic in asking people questions as we're trying to gain that information. Active listening is a critical skill in the learning process and a critical skill just in succeeding with transitions. We spoke briefly about SWOT, S-W-O-T, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And Michael suggests that instead of SWOT, we should try TOWS, T-O-W-S. In other words, the order should be these groups of two, where we start with threats and opportunities and then later discuss our team's weaknesses and strengths. When we start with strengths and weaknesses, we tend to find things that aren't too valuable. They're a little too abstract, but when you start with threats first, it'll yield a very quick conversation with quite a bit of substance. From that point, we can evaluate our team's strengths and weaknesses. And SWOT can really help create a shared reality for everyone on the team, which is very important. When we spoke about teams, Michael suggests that the team is the largest source of leverage that a leader has. It's important that the leader understands the STARS situation that they're in. Remember, STARS is startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, or sustained success. It's important to know which situation that you're in. That informs how you'll go about building your team coming through this transition. Understand how much teamwork is truly needed for your context. It's not necessarily a static philosophy around teamwork. It should be catered to how your team indeed works together. And finally, determine what you are looking for in people. That will help you assess your team and understand what you need and what you have. So there's the summary of today's episode, my conversation with Michael Watkins. Hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to the next episode of Leadership Voyage. Everyone, take care.